everybody. Today I'd like to talk about my 428 Mustang. Now you've probably seen this. It's been in the banner on the top of my page along with the Camaro, and I just thought maybe it was time to give you a little explanation and update for it. So I'm going to wade into one of those traditional areas of rivalry, which is Chevy versus Ford, Camaro versus Mustang. And it happens that I have something in both camps, right? And I'll start by saying that, you know, I was a GM guy, am a GM guy. I worked for them for over 38 years. I grew up in a family that drove only GM cars for a long time. And in the early 70s, my dad was planning a trip out west. He wanted to pull camper, travel trailer, and take us, you know, the kids all out to the desert Southwest and through Arizona, and it was a 6,000 mile loop. And we had a very nice station wagon, GM station wagon, that started having some issues, and just mostly due to old age more than anything. Wasn't anything defective in the car, it was just wearing out. So he went out with only about 2 months before the trip. He went out looking for a new car, and we went through all the GM dealers and looked at their, he wanted a station wagon, you know, the SUV of the day. And there were, you know, he had 4 of us kids, and, you know, station wagon gave you seating back in the back. But most of the local dealers, GM dealers, didn't have much. There wasn't much in stock. So at one point, he wanted to go down to the Ford dealer. And I thought he had maybe lost his mind, you know, because he would never consider a Ford. But he was, you know, his options were changing. And it just happened that in town we had a very large Ford dealer who also happened to have an adjoining dealership that sold RVs, travel trailers, and motorhomes. So he stocked a large number of cars. He had a number of station wagons, and many of his came with towing packages. He ordered for stock Class 3 packages that all you had to do was bolt on a receiver hitch, and you could pull 5,000 pounds or more. And so we went through and spent a couple days searching his lot, and my dad ended up buying a country sedan station wagon with a 429. And it did a pretty fair job. It sucked a lot of gas, but it got us all around, and it was a great trip. So, long story, but it broke the ice for Fords. So, you know, fast forward 2 or 3 more years, and I needed a car. I was almost 17. I was looking for a car, and somebody I knew had a Mustang, 67 Mustang convertible. And you go, convertible, cool. Well, the car was pretty high miles. It was a 289. It burned a lot of oil. It wasn't great. The top didn't work. The top had been cut by somebody breaking into the car. They cut the sides with a knife, and it was patched with duct tape. But the price was right. It was $300, $325. And for a guy at the time where I was earning $1.25 an hour in a retail store, sub-minimum wage because I was in high school, I ended up buying a Mustang. I kind of wanted a motorcycle, and my dad said, you can get cars all you want, but no motorcycles. Okay. So I bought that Mustang, and it served me well. It had its problems, but I figured out how to fix the convertible top. It was an electrical problem. I even got one of my friends to help me, and we replaced the convertible top in the driveway one summer day. Probably 2 summer days would be more accurate. So I drove that car about a year, and then, you know, I really needed something better, and I wanted a Camaro. or a Firebird. 400 Firebird would have been ideal too. But if I was looking at cars that were, you know, 4 or 5 years old, those cars were $1,500–1,600, maybe a little more. And Mustangs were relatively inexpensive and plentiful. And so I kept looking, but I found a 69 Mach 1, 351, 3-speed top loader floor shift, and for $500 at the Chevy dealer of all places. Bought it as is. It was a trade-in somebody had brought in, and it only had 40,000 miles on it. In fact, the dealer, after I made the purchase, decided they wanted to raise the price, and my dad wouldn't let them. I had a signed contract, you know, but they decided it should have been $700, not $500. Ah, well, so it goes. But I drove that through the rest of high school. I drove it through college. I kept it afterwards. I put 100,000 miles on that car, and I had a lot of fun with it. So Mustangs were pretty nice. So fast forward a little further, I was out of college, and I was preparing to do some restoration on that Mach 1. But it had a lot of rust. It was pretty worn out, and I decided that, you know, maybe if I was going to preserve a car, it ought to be one of the big block muscle cars. And I was paging through an Auto Trader one day and saw an ad that said, and of course in the days before internet, you know, Auto Trader paper, you know, that was how we did things. I saw an advertisement for a 69 Mach 1 428 Cobra Jet, $3,800. And I remarked to my wife, who was sitting in the room, I said, no, these cars will never get cheaper than this. That's really a great deal. And she said, well, why don't you go buy it? And I'm like, really? Well, she says, yeah, you know. And, you know, we talked about selling, you know, buying a new one and selling the old one. That paper was a couple of weeks old, and the car was gone. But it set me on, that was in a springtime. That set me off searching all summer. I spent the entire summer looking at muscle cars, and I mostly wanted a GM one. I was looking at Cutlass 442s, you know, W30s, big block 442s, GTOs, Chevelles, Camaros. I was running the gamut of everything, and I didn't forget about Mustangs. I would look at those too. I went through the whole route. Almost bought a Hurst Oldsmobile, 69 Hurst Olds. But then I found out that the original engine had been pulled, and, you know, things didn't line up. And there were a lot of cars that I looked at, and they were cut up. They weren't original anymore. So anyway, we get around to about fall, and I'm still looking, and I ran across an ad for another 428 Cobra Jet Mustang, Mach 1, and it was about an hour out from home, down in central Indiana. So I went out there to take a look. It looked pretty nice, and it drove pretty nice. I mean, I had looked at 428 Mustang. There was one I remember that, you know, the cam wasn't right. It sounded like a sewing machine. One had a cracked head that was weeping coolant outside the engine. I mean, it was dribbling off the side of the engine while it was idling. And somebody had tried to weld it, and the weld was leaking. Quite a variety. So anyway, I got out to this car, and we took it for a test drive. And I wrung it out pretty good. I romped on it, made sure that it sounded good, it felt good, it had power. It was the nicest running of the cars I had test driven. When you jumped on it, man, it just flew. So we went back. I wasn't an expert in Cobra Jets, so I was checking things out. And I saw a few things that I knew would need work. And so I told the guy, I said, okay, it looks pretty nice, but I want to think about it. And so, you know, I've got your number, I'll give you a call. And I started heading back to my car. And he said, wait, stop. And I said, why? What? He said, what would it take for you to buy that car right now? I asked him why. And he said, I'm afraid for my life. And I said, what do you mean? He said, well, you're the first one who's taken it out for a test drive that hasn't nearly killed me. He said, all these teenagers come out and they don't know how to handle these cars, and they want to test drive, and they get this thing all sideways. We get out on the county roads in between the farm fields, and they're getting this thing so crossed up, they're going to crash it and they're going to kill me. So I got to get this over, and so name your price. And I thought for a minute, because I really wasn't quite ready, but I thought for a minute. I knew what his price was, and I lowballed it. I not terrible, but it was a price I was comfortable with. I knocked about $1,000 off of what he was asking. And he swallowed hard and asked me to bump it up 50 bucks. And I said, okay. It was a price that I was comfortable with, knowing what I knew about the car. He had shown me all the receipts. He had a fresh engine in it. The engine had been, based on parts replaced, he'd spun a rod bearing. And he was a manager with UPS. And he had hired a couple of his mechanics off time, off hours, to go through the engine. So the engine was fresh. It was a 428 with forged TRW pistons, 30 over. The crank, everything was redone and rebuilt, and it was rebuilt to Cobra Jet specs. And he had all the receipts and everything to prove it. So I thought, hey, that's pretty cool. Anyway, I agreed to buy the car. I figured that at the price I had offered, if I was wrong, I could get my money back out of it. But I thought I was okay. The rest of the story is, when I went back to pick up the car, went back to buy it, we went down to the bank and transferred title and signed over the title, and guy gave him the money and he deposited it. And, afterwards, we went out and had coffee and just sat and talked for a bit. And I was relating the story of how I got on this quest to go through the summertime. And I had seen this car back in spring, a $3,800 car, how I had been searching all summer and then landed on this one at the end. And at that point what he said was, well, he said, this is the same car. This is the same car. He said, I bought that car out of that ad last spring, and I've driven it all summer. But it's just costing me too much to keep it going. He was not a mechanic himself. He was taking it to the dealer for everything down to adjusting headlights. And so it was costing him too much, and he'd had his fun and wanted to sell it. So I thought that was pretty cool. You can call it fate, or the stars aligning, or the Lord blessing you with something that just works out. Somehow it was meant to be for me to have this car. And I took it home. I did the paint on it in my garage. I learned how to paint, bought a compressor and learned how to paint. Painted it in about 1984. And since then, it's been little projects. And there will be some more as we go. It's a 428 with a shaker hood and R-code. It's a nice car. It's been a lot of fun, and I can tell you from my 351 was a fast car. I used to take it to the drag strip back in the day, and I got time slips off of it. And I think around my best time slip on like an 85-degree hot summer day was about 14 flat at 100 miles an hour through street tires and through some high-performance mufflers. I owned both these cars at the same time, and I'll just tell you is, this car would leave the 351 like it was parked. I mean, it was just really fast, and I'm more gentle with it in its old age, preserving it. But when I first bought it, and I was running it a little harder, basically you couldn't, it wouldn't take wide open throttle below about 30 miles an hour. It would just light them up. This 428's got a lot of torque, and it sucker just really goes. It just really goes. So, up until when I found the Camaro, this has been my hobby, and I still have projects to do on it. It's been more of a preservation than a restoration project. but I still have little things that it needs. It's not a numbers matching original car, and so now that I'm retired, I'm back to adding things to it and refining it a little bit more. I just think it's really been a wonderful thing that, you know, these cars, 428 Cobra Jets, are legendary cars. And Camaros, the IROCs, are also legendary cars in a different way, in a different time. And for me to be able to have one on both sides is, to me, is just phenomenal. And I really, I feel blessed to have had the opportunity to have both. I really love the Mustang, and I really love the Camaro. They're both great cars. They're a little different. I mean, this one's faster in a straight line, but man, that Camaro will go around corners like it's glued to the road. They're just, you know, they're a little bit different market. I'm hoping that my Camaro fans on the channel will grant me a little leeway, I'll call it, and allow me to share some things about the Mustang. I'm not done with the Camaro. There'll be more projects. I've still got plenty to do, and I'm going to keep going. I'm not done with it. But I'd like to mix a few things in about the Mustang as things happen, and you know, just recognize in the classic car world, we can like more than one. So that's all for today.